So our next speaker is Scott Stevens, and Scott is a professor of fire science at UC Berkeley. And I had him as a professor when I was just 20 or something many years ago. So it's exciting to be here and introduce him. We'll see if we can get his talk up. Okay. Okay, Scott, you've got your clicker and you're ready to roll.
Thank you, Stacy, for helping me. As a person that grew up in the North Bay, it's kind of pathetic that I got here late. I grew up in the city of Napa, so I figured I'd get here pretty easy, and it turned out that my memory of how to get here efficiently was poor. It's just amazing because I grew up there. I lived in Napa during the 81 Atlas Peak fire. So you remember the 81 fire, maybe some of you in the room. Anybody else lived in Napa in the 81 fire? I see a few hands. That was an interesting fire too. At the time, it was one that startled us a lot and got my attention. It was an arson fire. Somebody set like 6 or 7 devices to basically ignite simultaneously during a bad weather event. And it burned the eastern side of the Napa Valley. Terrible. It didn't kill anybody, thank goodness, but it actually burned quite a few houses. But to the last fire we had, of course, we call that the Atlas fire versus the Atlas Peak fire. Burns about the same imprint, but unfortunately has much more damage to both people and structures. So it is kind of a recurring cycle of fire and ecosystems that maybe some of us are going to be chatting about today. And Stacy's got this up. And I should have been here earlier. I actually left really early thinking I would be here way ahead of time.
Working on it.
No, oh my goodness. That's it. Perfect. Thank you, Stacy. Stacy, actually, maybe you haven't met her yet. She actually is the lady that runs the California Fire Science Consortium. So if you ever see the consortium newsletter or some of its outputs, thanks, Stacy, for that. So today I had a neat assignment of talking about the fire regimes of the vegetation of the study area, which includes certainly where we're standing here, but it also goes a little bit further. Here, maybe you can see a picture of some areas near Lake Berryessa, a place that I frequented an awful lot when I was a young guy, growing up and going to Vintage High School. So here we see a lot of complexity in vegetation patterns, and we'll talk about some of that today. Here is the study area or the conference area. Maybe you can see the white delineation of the map. Essentially, it's a very large area. It goes from Scotia is a small town in Humboldt County, goes all the way over to Red Bluff, and then goes south maybe to a line around Morro Bay. So this is kind of the conference organizer's template of the vegetation. And it includes both coastal areas and some interior areas as well, away from the coast. It has very diverse vegetation. And we're going to see that with my presentation, and many of you live in this area and you see it yourselves. And you go from coastal prairie all the way to maybe a mixed conifer or a ponderosa pine forest. Extraordinary in terms of vegetation diversity. And fire regimes are just as diverse as the vegetation. That's one thing I think is so important. Lenya did a great job of talking about fire regimes. And whenever I think about vegetation, ecosystems, and fire, the first thing that comes to my mind is fire regime. Because fire regimes are not equal around vegetation types. So you can have large flame lengths, as Lenya showed you, in some vegetation types, and ecologically it's completely appropriate. Human communities right next to it may be a problem. But from ecology of the system, thinking about fire regimes is really the bedrock, I think, of trying to look how we might go forward. First, I want to spend a moment about some history. This is one of my favorite pictures. You can see it's a little older. 3 people in here: Harold Weaver, Herbert Stoddard, Harold Biswell. These folks were actually at a fire conference in a very small community called Hoburgs. Hoburgs is really close to Middletown, just up the hill, a little way out of Cobb Mountain. It burned a couple years ago, unfortunately, a few years ago in the Valley Fire. But in '67, it was literally the fire capital of the world. I think that's just amazing. And that actually is inside the template of the organization conference area. So the 3 gentlemen here are really stellars of fire ecology. Weaver's on the left. Weaver was a Bureau of Indian Affairs, a forester up in central eastern Oregon, also northern Arizona. Probably created the most significant prescribed fire program in the western U.S., even to date. Just extraordinary. Burning up to 100,000 acres over 5, 7, 10 years. Extraordinary. The center person is someone that Lenya introduced you to, longleaf pine. longleaf pine in the southeast. Here is actually the person that worked on that a ton, Herbert Stoddard. Stoddard was one of those early fire ecologists that were extraordinarily important. And then the one on the far right is Harold Biswell. Biswell was a professor at UC Berkeley, where I'm at. He came to Berkeley in 1947 and started to work a great deal in fire. So in some ways, I think it's kind of interesting just to think of how, even in the 60s, this part of California was getting quite a bit of kudos from fire. In terms of, you know, an international conference was actually held at Hoburgs. The next picture is actually much sadder. This is actually the site of the international conference place. And it actually did burn, unfortunately, in the Valley Fire. I read the proceedings from this meeting, and people had short articles. Biswell, Harold Weaver, Vogel, another really early ecologist, Hardersvelt, San Jose State University. They all discussed the ecological importance of fire in the region. Raymond from CDF, an early forester and CAL FIRE, Zanuska, a professor at UC Berkeley, of course where I'm at, didn't support the idea of ecological use of fire, and they actually made it very clear in the 67 proceedings. One thing that was in this proceedings at the time was the idea of controlling brush and the idea of actually doing type conversion, taking shrubs and moving them to grass. That we'd have better grazing, better forage, maybe a better economy. So that was a huge part of this proceedings. What about ignitions? Ignitions are so important. Ignitions are going to be variable in this very diverse region. High mountains, you can have lightning fire. Remember June 2008? June 2008 turned out to be an extraordinary lightning bust. We had so many fires in California going simultaneously all over the state. And smoked out areas that smoked out the Bay Area for months, smoked out a lot of areas of the North Bay, smoked out the Siskiyou Mountains, smoked out areas even further. So lightning, yes, it is important in a lot of areas. It really comes episodically a lot of times. We don't generally get average lightning ignitions. We either get a few or a bunch. And we can make a calculation of an average, but generally we get these episodic areas of lightning. Extraordinary. What about the low elevation areas? The low elevation areas, really it's people. Anthropogenic. So you're talking about people starting fires. And of course, one group of people that used to do this is Native people, Native Americans. And here we know, at least from the contemporary record, the last 100 years or so, there's very, very few lightning fires. John Keeley wrote a paper, I just believe, in 1977. So coastal California doesn't have much lightning fire, but it has anthropogenic or people fire. A little bit more about Native American burning. I find this extraordinary. I've read about this a bunch lately. It turns out I'm actually going to co-teach a course at Berkeley this fall on cultural aspects of fire in California, and we're going to spend a lot of time actually talking about Native Americans with Professor Kent Lightfoot, anthropologist, UC Berkeley. If you're interested in reading about kind of Native people and their influences on fire regimes throughout the whole country, there's this book, Forgotten Fires, from Omar Stewart, University of Oklahoma Press, 2002. I find it an extraordinary book. It was first written in manuscript form and actually given to a New York publisher in the early 50s and was declined. Then he sent it to the Viking Fund for Publications in Anthropology. It was declined. Then he actually took it to the Tall Timbers Research Station. This is the place where Stoddard and all these other folks, Comarak and all these other folks did, thinking that it could be reviewed maybe there and actually published. It was held for 25 years and declined. And then University of Oklahoma finally got the book in 92. 6 months later, Stewart dies, and it actually is published in 2002. And I just look at this as an extraordinary history of really the suppression of ideas of Native American management of ecosystems. That's my view. Maybe you might have a different view. But I think this just shows us, the idea of how Native peoples used to actually manage ecosystems, how they actually had direct influence, how they really had profound influence on a lot of ecosystems. There really was a significant bias of this idea. Terrible bias. One was Julian Stewart. Stewart was actually really antagonistic to this view. And if you read some of his papers, he basically says Native people didn't do anything like that. So there was quite a dichotomy of views that I think we just maybe need to acknowledge sometimes, of just how we think about Native peoples and how they actually influence burning. A little picture here about Native peoples. I know Truck Strickland is actually going to talk about this tomorrow. Maybe Truck's in the room already. So here we have footnotes. We have early explorers of ideas of how Native people used to burn. We have one fire scar study inside this conference area. I'm going to talk about that at the end of the talk. Strong cultural history of burning for diverse objectives. Managing for vegetation, for food, for medicine, for safety around their communities, all sorts of reasons, okay? So now I'm going to jump into the vegetation types, and we're going to go from the coast of California, and we're going inland. One of the first ones is here, the coastal prairie. It's a really interesting place. Perennial grassland dominated, a place of extraordinary fire use by Native people. Native people used to burn these sites regularly to keep them open, collect seed for food, a lot of other reasons. One reason this is a black and white photograph, it comes out of the University of California Fire and California Ecosystems book. The second edition, that book's coming out this summer. So if you're interested in maybe thinking about fire in California ecosystems, the first edition was 2006. The second one will be in 2018. It might be something that hopefully maybe is of interest to some. And the intervals are short for Native people. Without Native people, you haven't got fire in this site. Okay, you got to have people putting fire on the ground. There's not lightning much that's going to create a fire regime on this place. Native fire severity, I would say it's high, just like Lenya said, it changes the dominant organism. It's a grassland. You burn up the grassland, it's a dominant organism, high severity. Of course, the plants will resprout. Now we're going to Redwood, and another one that Lenya talked about. Coast Redwood, a beautiful place. Majority of studies that actually have done fire history in the Coast Redwood forest have found intervals of relatively short interval, 10 years, 7 years, 15, 20, of hundreds and hundreds of years in the past, where Redwood basically is recording fire in its tree rings. And here is actually a place that we actually collected some of this in the Santa Cruz Mountains, so a little bit further south of where we are today. And you can see there's a chainsaw there and an old stump's been carved up. And we're looking for fire history data. We're looking for evidence of fire history. Then on the right side, you see there's a piece from the field. And that is one cool thing to hold, because that right there is evidence of Native American burning right in your hand. That's a fire scar right in your hand from people burning in the Coast Redwood region, and you got it right in your hand. I find that extraordinary. There's a lot of places in California where you have a confounding lightning regime and maybe a Native American regime. It's hard to get them apart just because you have simultaneous ignitions, right? Unfortunately, tree rings can't talk to us. I wish they could, but they can't talk to us. So coastal California is different. Without lightning, you get yourself some fire scars. You got yourself a record of human fire use. What about California and the grasslands? Another one of the areas of interest around here, of course. And of course, they've been changed. We have Mediterranean annuals that dominate many of these. Here's a prescribed fire we did at Jasper Ridge, a Stanford property a number of years ago, San Mateo County. Here we would expect fire intervals to be relatively frequent, mostly from Native American burning again. Severity, I would say, is high again because you're consuming the vegetation. And that means high severity in my mind. Doesn't mean, you know, things are going to disaster. It just means you burned up the vegetation and then it probably comes back very easily. And moderate to large size. You probably a lot of continuity of these fuels, a lot of ability to regenerate them quickly. So you're talking about a fire regime that can support those types of size. Another vegetation type in our study area, coastal scrub, coyote bush. An area of kind of a little bit interior, woody vegetation. Doesn't burn as easily as I would say chaparral, but I would say when it does burn, high severity. And we can see here, this is the Oakland Hills. This is actually inside the 91 fire print. A lot of coastal scrub, native plant communities that does burn, but probably not as frequently as grassland and probably tied more to weather events or maybe dryness. What about oaks? Well, oaks are something that I think a lot of us love. You know, I love oaks. You know, they're so diverse in this state. And of course, Native peoples use oaks throughout the state. They didn't use every oak species. Some were actually better. From my communication, I guess the most favored oak was tan oak and California black oak. Both of those had the best flavor, and they were actually traded throughout California. Other oak species like the live oaks, not as good. They didn't taste as good, plus the productivity wasn't as high. But when you think about how oaks used to burn, I think this picture here from the Hopland Research Station probably is somewhat of a surrogate. You're looking at essentially low flame lengths, burning through oak litter, probably burning maybe every few years or so by native people again, maybe augmented a little bit by lightning, but very, very common fire occurrence in, I would say, oak woodlands, another very common type in our conference area. And here's a fire that actually happened. This is the Nuns fire just out of Glen, all right? So here you see, these are mostly blue oak, Quercus glassii, and you see the foliage is dead. Those trees don't care. Those things are coming right back, okay? These oaks are basically a fire that scorches their leaves just from heat, drops some leaves, next year you're not gonna know. So this is a very vibrant, dynamic system also where frequent fire was probably a very, very common occurrence and probably, again, tied to Native American management. Lenya showed you a picture a little like this. This is the Bald Hills. So an area of burning where things like Douglas fir encroachment, where you want conifers out and you want oaks and grass in. We got a lot of conifers, okay? If anything, I think grasslands are undervalued. We just don't have as many of those. We probably, many of those are certainly used for agriculture, other things. So here we have a lot of managers trying to maybe simulate, again, maybe a Native American practice where you're burning these hills, trying to get out the conifers, kill them when they're young before they get thick bark, as Lenya told you, and then keep the dominance of the oaks and also the grasslands. Now we're in really close to where we're sitting right now. We're also near Glen once again. Here's a picture just uphill from Glen. This actually has mixed evergreen forest where you have bay, madrone, coast live oak, a little bit of Douglas fir, maybe a little wetter spots. That is a really interesting fire regime, much more complex. Underburn sometimes, and maybe patches of crown fire and other. The moderate severity or mixed severity fire regime, we might call it. The big patch in the dead center is chaparral. We'll talk about chaparral some more in a minute. But chaparral, of course, is a different vegetation type. So that's why when you look even at one hill, you got potentially 3 fire regimes right in front of you. You know, you got oak woodlands, low regime. You got maybe mixed evergreen where you got a mixed severity regime, and you got chaparral in there as well. I mean, this is really interesting and also diverse and also challenging for managers because it's not a one size fits all. There's a lot of things going on there. Another one goes on is things like sudden oak death, sod, right? Sod is a introduced disease and kills tan oak big time. And it's shown, Lenya's done some work on this, colleagues have done work on this, that in most cases, it seems like when we have dead trees killed by sod, we actually increase fire severity versus an area that didn't have sod. So we got an interaction. Another thing about fire regimes, a lot of times they interact with things that sometimes surprise us, like insects, maybe sometimes drought, invasive species. These are something in the 21st century that's basically going to be with us forever. So I find these the most difficult to really anticipate. But sometimes they're things that can just knock your socks off because it can be so profound. And it's hard. A lot of people work on these and it's difficult, but when we have these interactions of fire with something else, with climate change and less variability, more variability in climate, we're headed for more interactions. We're headed there. Chaparral. Chaparral is an amazing community. You know, evergreen shrubs, diverse. Generally, we think of it as an infrequent, high severity fire regime, maybe 30, 50, 70 years in that range. Burns, when it does burn, it generally generates a lot of heat. There it is. Maybe you can see that person hanging out there in the bottom, okay? This is one of the prescribed fires we've done at Cow Mountain, BLM Mountain, right here out of Ukiah. And this is in very benign conditions. You're talking about humidity 50%, temperature probably about 68, and wind speed maybe 3 miles an hour. And you're getting flame lengths on the order of 50 feet, right? So think about this during a big wind event like we had last fall, unfortunately, right? This fuel bed is reactive. It's just reactive. And it's very difficult then to think of how people live next to this fuel bed. Very difficult, just like it did in the 1981 Atlas Peak fire. It's difficult because you got a fire regime that's stand replacement, and when you actually get a fire in it, you got intensity. So, but Chaparral is happy as a clam. Right here is a picture right after a few weeks. A chamise plant that's resprouted, Endostoma fasciculatum, you know, very common plant in the chaparral, sprouting from the base just a few weeks after fire. An extraordinary plant diversity after fire, you know, when you have annuals and biennials come in and incredible diversity of flora as the chaparral regrows. One problem is if you burn it too often, you can actually, as Lenya told you, a crown fire adaptive system, you burn it too often, the propagules get reduced and then your chaparral starts to decrease. A real problem, and it's actually being observed already in Southern California in places. I imagine someone will tell us about that a little later. Knobcone pine. So here's that serotinous species that Lenya showed you. Here's a fire that we actually did, a prescribed crown fire in Cow Mountain. The goal was actually to see if we could regenerate that knobcone pine. Turned out under prescribed conditions, much harder to burn that dude. Really hard, even dry. You know, we run on fire up the hill with that chaparral with flame like 40 feet, 30 feet, and 4 out of 5 times it would even propagate inside that knobcone. So it tells you a little about it just when it burns, right? Probably burns under even drier conditions, probably hotter conditions, you know. So Another one of those fire regime aspects. High severity, relatively long interval. When it burns, it's kind of a piece of the Chaparral fire regime, at least in a lot of areas we have it. This is what it looks like afterwards. Another one for the recent fires. A lot of seeds going to drop. That's very typical. So you look at that and you go, that's a bloody disaster. Oh, no, it's not actually. As long as it's got seed in the crown and seed falling down, that's going to be a Knobcone pine forest again. Again, if you're next to that place and you have a home or a road, it's a different story. I wanted to show this picture of some data we actually took from Cow Mountain. And you see a fire scar in a cross-section of the Knobcone. So not all the trees are dead. And then on the lower right, you see two panels. One of them shows a regeneration event right around 1940, where a lot of trees about 1940, very synchronous, right? Nice, clean, high-severity fire regime. The one on the right shows you a lot more dispersed. So I think I just wanted to put this in here because we talk about fire regimes, sometimes low severity, high severity, mixed severity. They're all a little mixed up. So even though you say low severity regime, like maybe ponderosa pine, you're probably going to have some high severity component. And of course, the other contrast is you got a high severity regime here in Knobcone pine, and we have some evidence of maybe some low severity component. So we bend those things as humans, but the ecology just doesn't follow it all the time. So there's more complexity in fire regimes in any of them than probably we give credit sometimes. Blue gum eucalyptus. I had to put this in here. I was thinking about it. This is a part of our ecosystem, right? This is something we planted. And the picture on the right is actually its native habitat. That is in Victoria, Australia, a place I visited in 2008. So blue gum in Australia is a coastal species, more maritime, and it burns under really high severity and mixed severity. That's its fire regime. On the left, maybe you see some eucalyptus in the hills, drier environment, very productive and potential to move fire around. Also embers from bark and other things. So it's something we just introduced, as Len, you pointed out, great. Humans have brought this in and we've changed fire regime, we've changed ecosystem. We're going uphill. Douglas-fir. I'm getting pretty close to the end. How much more time have I got? Could you tell me, please? 8 minutes, perfect, thank you. I got a watch on, but I didn't look at it very good. So now we're in Douglas-fir country. Douglas-fir, this is actually a little higher up, of course, in the north coast. It's not going to be as prevalent in the south. We have pseudosua macrocarpa down there, which is another species of Douglas-fir, which is actually really interesting because it completely resprouts if you top kill it. Yeah, it completely resprouts like coast redwood. Amazing. Whereas our Douglas-fir here in the North Bay will not resprout. But now we're in a higher elevation, more mixed severity fire regime, moderate intervals, and we see, Douglas-fir, being able to really live in that type of system. Ponderosa pine. This is actually in the Mendocino National Forest, an area that Carl Skinner and Alan Taylor, myself, and a couple others did some work on fire history. And you can see these are kind of small trees, maybe one larger one there, relatively low severity regime, we would think. High frequency. Here we have lightning and native people maybe, so we got both ignition sources. Here's Alan Taylor from Penn State University, and he's looking at a real nice fire scar. That's one of those things that you're hunting fire scars, you go, that's a beauty. It's an old stump. So cuts it up, put some duct tape around it, take it back to the lab, take it apart and date it, get an idea of just the dates of those fire scars. Amazingly, the number of scars that are still in California ecosystems is extraordinary. Any place that's got a pine dominance to it, generally you're going to have fire scars. Coast redwood's good, giant sequoia is good. So one thing about this study, there's a little text there, it's probably too much, so I'll just kind of give you the highlights. This study was on some ponderosa pine that was on a ridge that was completely continuous to the Sacramento Valley. So down to the east, to the Sacramento Valley. And when Alan and Carl dated those scars, they looked for seasonality, as Lenya told you, seasonality. When in the year did the fire burn? When you have an annual ring, you can actually see the lesion come into the ring. Is it on the ring boundary? Is it in the growing period? We call that the early wood, or maybe the late wood. The late wood is a dark part of the ring. So you can actually get a sense of when the scar is in that area. So before 1850, those pines recorded some of the most frequent fire of any site in the pine-dominant ecosystem in California. Incredibly frequent, 4 or 5 years, that range. And that tree rings had many, many more early wood scars. So the scars were early in the year, early. After 1850, the interval goes up and almost all the scars go to late wood or dormant. We think that is a clear signal of Native American burning in the Sacramento Valley and those fires vectoring up into the hills and being recorded in the tree rings, and then subsequent removal of native people right around 1850. And that changes then the seasonality of fire and also the frequency of it. So I find that as an extraordinary piece of evidence of influence of native people. Summary: grasslands, oak woodlands, prairies, redwood, they used to burn a lot. And they were all burned by people for a lot of reasons. Chaparral, closed cone pines, other things, more mixed severity. Climate change could really impact those. We start to burn those too much, we're going to change vegetation type, we're going to modify them. Eucalyptus is challenging because it's so productive and it can really burn and throw embers. Ponderosa and Douglas-fir forest in the region, fire suppression has increased fuel loads. Can't really say that about many of the other ecosystems in this system. Fire continues to be a major player, no doubt. We're not seeing it going away. I call California the pyro state because of just the extraordinary connection of California to fire. High severity regimes are probably most sensitive. Human ignitions are important. Urban interface issues will continue really to challenge and haunt us. Native American burning could increase. We're seeing some of that in this region and elsewhere. And there's no one size fits all for vegetation, and there's no one size fits all either for how you might manage it to try to actually reduce hazard and maybe increase human communities. It's a little more complex here in this world. It's not impossible, but it's a little more complex. And with that, I'll just acknowledge a couple of folks and thank you for listening.
We have time for a question or two if you'd like to ask Scott something, but there's also a discussion afterwards. Is that a question walking to a microphone? Great, we'll do that and we'll get Marshall. Marshall, once you come up, we'll get you set up.
Now it's on. I'm lucky enough to live in an area where coastal redwoods blend into Knobcone pines, and I see chaparral around there. It seems to be a transitional community. You were talking earlier about prescribed fire in Knobcone pines and how difficult it is to ignite. Could you and I think you were saying that it was that the fire ignition was dominated by ignition spray from chaparral. Could you say a little bit more about that, please?
I'd be happy to. You know, you described it perfectly. We've been setting up this project for many years. We tried to burn both in the fall and the spring, thinking we could maybe do some burning in the spring to actually maybe regenerate Knobcone pine, and burn in the fall, which is more customary to probably its historical season. And we just thought we would vector fire into the Knobcone stands, which are 5 acres, 10 acre stands from mature chaparral. And that's what we did. But the thing that was surprising, we had a little cloud cover. I'm convinced that actually cloud cover changes live fuel moisture enough, and actually fuel temperature, if you sometimes cannot propagate fire. I've seen it in chaparral too. That day we had a little cover. So when we actually had good ignition in the chaparral, good fire spread, 60-foot flame length running into Knobcone pine, and at least that day, we only had 1 out of 5 stands burned. So I think it just shows you again, the conditions they burn under is going to be more wind driven, probably hotter and drier. We're probably burning 72 degrees, humidity is probably about 45% and no wind. So in those conditions, we were unsuccessful, and even with some slope.
Yes, thank you. I was wondering how that slash and squirt program in Mendocino and Humboldt, parts of Northern California, are working with millions of dead standing tan-oak trees. And I heard you say that they were a favored tree for the Native American Indians. And of course, all the fire departments being horrified with that continued practice. Also, I had another question, and maybe you could answer that. Pacific Gas and Electric has cloud seeding permits for geoengineering in Northern California. Anyone can look that up. And I wanted to know what the effects of those chemicals for cloud seeding had to do with the trees, and how the trees might be affected by those chemicals. Thank you.
Sure. Unfortunately, the second question, I'm afraid I couldn't answer. I wish I could, but I can't. I just don't have that background. The first question is interesting, like the idea of maybe killing tan oak by herbicides, ringing them, trying to maybe reduce their density and actually increasing things like Douglas-fir. There's no doubt that if you do that, you do increase the tendency, you're going to have dead foliage, lower fuel moisture content. And a few years, you're going to drop some of that moisture or some of that dead foliage onto the ground, and probably then probably not changing fire hazard too much. But I would, there's people in this room probably have studied this more than I, but I would say that in general that has a tendency to increase fire hazards for a few years. If you cut them down and maybe lop and scatter them, distribute them a little bit, probably reduces that potential a little bit. But that, a little like the sod outcome, probably just increases fire hazard for a short time.
You can do one more. I'm just waiting for this thing to save. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Scott, following Lenya's excellent presentation on adaptations, what do you make out of the fact that if you look at how Coast Redwood responds to fire versus the Sierra sequoias, the Coast Redwood is a vigorous resprouter, Sierra Nevada plant is an obligate cedar, totally incapable of resprout. What does that tell you about the fire regimes?
Well, John, you asked a question that is awesomely interesting, but one I think is challenging. I think that might tell us that at one time Coast Redwood maybe had more of a mixed severity regime. It probably had the ability, some reason in its long genome, as you know, that plant's been around hundreds of millions of years, including the Northern Hemisphere, Europe, everywhere. That plant at one time had an adaptation to resprout that was brought forward, and probably now fire is working with it. But I would think that just would tell me, versus giant sequoia, which doesn't do that. Giant sequoia does not resprout. It can't resprout. It doesn't resprout from the base. Coast Redwood, if you actually burn it and actually just kill its leaves, you come back in 2 years, it resprouts epichromically from the branches. And in 3 or 4 years, you can't even tell it's been burned. It's extraordinary. It just comes back. Giant sequoia doesn't do that. And I just think maybe that just tells me that in its evolutionary history that used to have something happen to Coast Redwood that probably had a mixed severity event of something that it was able then to resprout from and have an enabling. But I haven't got a good question for that. That is an interesting question and one that I would have a hard time answering.
Good.